and now it goes quiet.
Well, some people came to me during the break. So.
Yeah. Because they didn't want to have to say it out loud. Jean.
How would you explain to children, little children, if someone has not yet?
Yeah. With small kids, it's always good to talk to them according to their level of understanding, because we don't need to give them the whole story from A to Z. You know, I find that oftentimes what's important is simply answering their questions, you know, because the kids will be very curious. They're very curious by nature. It's okay to answer their questions, and it's okay not to know, you know, and it's okay to say some people believe this, some people believe that, you know. So it's fine to be able to answer them, to give them brief answers. And I find that the most important thing with children also is include them in the rituals. You know, bring them to the funerals, bring them to the wakes, you know. Let them see the adults grieving, because it's okay that they see that, because once they see that, it makes it okay for them to feel it as well. So it's really, really important for them to see that. Not to spare them from that, you know. There's always that idea that, oh, we want to protect them. Well, yeah, protecting them is one thing, but allowing them to see emotion is also important, you know.
And they can be pretty blunt.
Yes.
Kids, I don't know if you've noticed this, when someone in the family passes, they are processing. They're the first ones to say, Granddad died, or Granddad is dead. They're the first ones to, everybody else is, you know, kind of tenderly going about it, but kids, like, you're right to the point.
I remember when my dad died, and my kids were just 15, 20 months. Anyway, I said, aren't you coming? I took him to the wake, and he stood at the coffin, with long hair, and he stood there and he smiled and smiled. He said, "Rather strange." And I said, "What's so funny?" And he said, "Oh, Grandpa's just driving around on the fields there with his brand new tractor." But that was in his mind. And then the other one, she wouldn't come to the funeral, and she was so close to him. And she said, "No, he's not there. He's got a new set of clothes, white ones," she said, "and he's in heaven now." That was her. And then Colleen, she accepts the whole thing in a different way. She was sad.
Well, that comes back to what Ali-John was saying.
She spent a lot of time there with them and farm.
Yeah, and we all process differently and at different rates, correct?
Mm-hmm.
But it's amazing how what their little minds will put through, and they were quite conservative, and that's from Sunday school teachings.
Who else has a question? Monica.
Okay, I have a friend who has Alzheimer's, and I thought first when you said you were talking about grieving a living person, I thought you were going to talk about that, because that's a whole
Yes.
different kind of grief.
That is a whole different type of grief, because you're getting the sense of losing a person in front of you, and they're not quite the same as what they were before, you know, and they can also be very contentious towards you as well, or snappy in some ways, right? It's difficult to see that shift, but you know, and we can feel powerless. Some of the emotions we feel, especially, is powerlessness, sadness at seeing them change. But yet at the same time, you know, you're still fostering important moments, and you're still offering humanity when you're with them. So unless it's too volatile, it's too dangerous, I don't think it's necessarily bad to spend time and to choose your moments with them, of course, you know. It's the things that we don't do that we end up regretting more than the things that we do.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So I always say, you know, spending time with someone, you know, that way, you know, it can be hard because there can be different things, of course, that you've observed, you know, in terms of questions, etc., different things that come up over and over. But it's the relationship that matters, I find.
And if you get into a volatile situation, the best thing to do is just stand up and leave for 5 minutes.
Yep. Yeah, keep yourself in check.
Yeah.
Try to keep yourself in check. It's not about you. It's about something else. You know, that's really important also to realize. But you're right, that's its whole other subject, and maybe that would be for another talk, you know?
Okay, thank you. Safety of both first.
Yes, very important.
Anyone else? I know Eric has a question.
One of the questions I hear all the time, which to me goes back to your Viktor Frankl reference, is why me? What did I do that this happened to me? Why did Uncle Bob get cancer? Why did Janet get into a car accident and die or get paralyzed? To me, that's an existential question. That because our universe isn't what we thought it was, because we're taught if I do all the right things, good things will happen.
That's right.
So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. What you're alluding to is this notion of cosmic justice, right? And we think that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, you know? And while it's true, of course, if you live a life of crime and different things, well, you're going to be faced with different problems that other people would not be faced with, of course. So there is a bit of a cause and effect there in some cases. But in other cases, right, why does something happen, you know, to a good person, right? And I think it was Harold Kushner that wrote a book on when bad things happen to good people, you know, and it's not a very simple question to answer, right? It's not for us to say, why did that happen and not that, right? Why did the Titanic sink, right? There's so many different questions we can come up with, you know, and try to come up with an answer.
How can we help with somebody who's struggling with these questions?
Well, I find that usually with that very question, there's a value conflict going on, right? Because you're faced with a situation where there's a lack of control, or that your view of the world is somehow changed, right? So all of a sudden it's like, maybe, you know, all of a sudden it's not just good things happening to good people, you know? So in that way, when you're faced with that, then there's a sense of vulnerability that comes, I think, with living life, right? And that's the thing that happens, is oftentimes we're all faced with vulnerability, right? And we don't really know when our ticket is out, to be honest, right? So it's not easy to be faced with these situations, and I find that it's good to ask the question, why this and not that? You know, why did this happen? And I also think that it's also good to look at how that affected us, right? And we forget about doing that. If we're so busy trying to figure out on the outside why something happened, you know, we're forgetting about how something's affecting us. And I often have people come to me and say, I want to find out about this. I want to find out why I do that, you know? And I said, okay, well, I can give you an answer why you do that. Here's the answer. Are you satisfied? Does that make the problem went away? And they say, no. Well, maybe it's not the answer you're looking for. Maybe having the answer to why something happened, you know, cosmically speaking, is not the answer. Maybe the answer is, how do you manage to cope in your own life with that? How do you live with the fact that that's happened now? And that's why I come back to that particular question with Viktor Frankl. You know, how do you make sense of it, right? How do you make the best of it? Anybody else? If you're thinking of a question, chances are other people are thinking of a question exactly the same. So.
Okay, I'm going to ask another question, but I need some help. Can you touch on the cycle of the conflicting emotions, feeling relief, then guilt, and perhaps living into regret, gaslighting yourself.
Yeah. Oftentimes we can go back and forth, you know, especially if you're an optimistic person, you're going to hope somehow that the result's going to be different if you're meeting with someone else, for example. You're going to say, this time this isn't going to play out this way, you know, there's going to be, the last situation was an isolated outcome, you know. And if we're not careful, we can go through a little bit of what's called euphoric recall when it comes to certain people or certain experiences. We can tend to put on rosy colored glasses and think that something was more positive than what it really was. So we think that that's going to be the outcome when we go and do it again. And then we're flabbergasted that we get the same sense, the same type of response, you know. And I find that, you know, the past is a good indicator of the future. You know, it's a good predictor of the future when it comes to things that way. Especially if some people have experienced the same behavior. You know, there's a saying in French that says, fidèle à soi-même, which means faithful to yourself, which means essentially you're going to do exactly what's expected of you because of the fact that you've always been doing it that way. So in some ways, that's kind of what that means in that way. So it's, if someone's been treating you in a certain way or has caused you to feel a certain way over and over and over again, then that person's not changing. So if you want change from that situation, it might be that you may need to change. And that's the thing that happens oftentimes. If the other person is being faithful to themselves, you know, then you're going to be reliving the same things if all the conditions are the same. So that's why I find it's a magical question to ask ourselves, what can we do different? And that takes us out of the stuckness. Makes us feel unstuck, so that way we can have a different outcome. Otherwise, we're reliving the same thing over and over again. I had once somebody that was telling me they would be invited to a family gathering, or not a gathering, but like a bit of a circle around the fire there, I guess. You know, they have like a bit of a fire outside. They said, come on over, you know, we're just doing this. And they'd bite the hook all the time. They would go. You know, they kept on telling me once they came back, oh, he said this, he pointed out each and every one of us, and he told us all of our faults. You know, he had fun doing it. You know, we left, we were angry, we were outraged. And I asked them, I said, well, why'd you go? Well, he invited us. Yeah, like he did the last time. Why'd you go? Well, he was really, really nice with his words. He said to us, you know, that, you know, he really wanted us there. And we thought it would be different this time. Was it? No. So sometimes we have to be the ones that change in some ways. We have to protect ourselves from certain toxic behaviors that happen, you know, because we tend to forget sometimes about how it was, and sometimes we need to purposefully recall how it was, you know, to break the euphoric recall, to remember just what happened that caused you to leave the last few times. So that's really, really important.
So I have a follow-up question.
Sure.
Is there, what would be a strategy for grieving and living with the fact that someone who was always hurtful, sometimes extremely so, and you can have estrangement, and estrangement is a healthy thing, but then that person dies.
Yep.
And then there is no way to ever hear, I'm sorry, and we all hope for that.
Yep.
I always hold that way. It's gone.
Yes, we do.
And a lot of people deal with that.
Yeah. You know, there's something with what you just said there with regards to incompleteness. You know, and I find that oftentimes, you know, when we're watching a movie, we often want to have the beginning, the middle, and the end, you know. And, you know, oftentimes, you know, if you don't have one of these parts, then it kind of plays on the mind. It kind of makes you think, what did I miss somehow, you know? I was watching AI, actually, artificial intelligence on VHS back in the day, The VHS tape popped out. And just the VCR just ate it up. And I was like, no, I want to see how this ends. You know, I didn't have it. And for some reason, I don't know why, it took many years before I got to see the ending again, you know. I just rented the movie somewhere else, you know. But I never did. And I eventually did see the ending, and it kind of appeased me finally. I was like, finally, I know, you know. And sometimes we need that. Sometimes, you know, if we don't have that and we're left in a space of incompleteness, we have to learn to go into the okay with that. And it's not always easy because, like you said, with death, there's a finality that comes with the idea that you're never going to be speaking you know, quite the same way with a person ever again. You know, you can choose to speak out loud to them, of course, if you like, but you know, it's seldom that we get answers, right? So, yeah, it's a challenge when it comes to incompleteness because it plays on the mind, and we can start to judge ourselves or feel as though it's our fault, you know, somehow, or why didn't I make this right? And we have to be careful about what I like to call personalization. Because if you take it on and you make it about something you didn't do, then you're basically pulling at yourself. And you're giving yourself a sense of over-responsibility that's hurtful and unnecessary. Because the estrangement happened because of the other person. The other person's inability to be able to experience a healthy relationship with you. And we so want to have influence in our lives that sometimes we tend to make ourselves overly responsible for certain things. And I have to catch people when they do that. I tell them that that's personalization. You're taking on something that's not yours. So we need to be careful about that because the mind wants resolution and it tends to go into that space. So learning to work with the idea that there's incompleteness and working with the exercise I gave you a little bit earlier about going into the okay. That's one way of working with incompleteness. You know, so if you can go and allow yourself to dwell into the okay, it appeases the incompleteness when you're experiencing it. And the more you do that, the more you're appeasing yourself over time. You know, and you're soothing yourself as you're doing that. So it's a really, really important exercise to be able to do when we're faced with that.
And if you keep going back to the place of the abuser, if that person was an abuser, then you're keeping yourself in that cycle of abuse.
You are, because you are reliving that type of experience to some extent if there's trauma. If there's trauma experienced, then your mind's wanting to make sense of what's happened. You know, and sometimes, well, you usually need to go into therapy when you've experienced trauma that you were reliving. And if it's affecting how you're functioning, then yes, I would say in some ways it's important to work on it. That's a good reason to go into therapy.
There are lots of good reasons to go to therapy.
Yes, there are.
Anyone else have a question?
I'm gonna prime the pump one more time.
Okay, I got one.
Oh, Larry's got one, okay.
Yeah. When we can see that somebody's going mourning, and it might be an old wound, and or teenagers do it, you know. So how is your day out of 10? Don't want to talk about it. If they're good or bad, don't want to talk about it. Or people say, I don't want to talk about it because I don't want to go to the meeting because I might cry. Or someone in the community dies and one of the friends says, I didn't go because I thought I might cry, or I didn't know what to say. And we, I think, are very almost ashamed of our emotion. And sometimes we say, damn it all, I am so angry. We keep putting it back and back and back. And then when we least expect it, it comes to us and we are kind of undone. I found that when, years ago, the two oldest children had gone away to university, and that I was too often tearful, and so I went to a psychiatrist that we had visited as a family, and he said, I think that you're moving from being a housewife to going into a very high stress job, and you're experiencing a lot of stress. And I thought, never thought that. Couldn't imagine why I was so tearful all the time. So it was just so good to go to somebody. You should have an office full of people all the time. Just to say, I don't know what's wrong. This is my situation. Tell me what you think. And we become silenced in our grief. Yeah, it's easy for me to say, I can say anything at all, but I haven't had a whole lot to cry about in life.
Mary, that brings me to a question.
Yeah.
How can we help ourselves or others who are facing a loss of an identity, a loss of identity as parents, the empty nest syndrome,
Yeah,
or the loss of identity as a spouse?
yeah. I was thinking of that just as you were talking, I was thinking empty nest syndrome just as you were talking about the kids leaving, There's loss of identity that happens in different stages in life as well, and it's good to understand where we are in terms of stages in life, because it's true though that sometimes in a given stage, as we transition to the next stage, there's certain things that start to happen, right? And let's also remember that the kids are transitioning to a certain stage as well, right? If they're leaving, it's because they're ready to start their adventure. They're ready to differentiate themselves from you, right? They want to become their own people. And that's a good thing, fundamentally, because all of us want to be our own persons. We don't want to get the sense that we're so tied to somebody that we can't be ourselves, right? So it feels difficult for you because it's a cutoff when that happens, right? And it's understandable that all of a sudden, who am I, right? The kids aren't there, if you devoted your entire life to do that and to raise them, and all of a sudden, they're no longer there, then who am I? You're forced to answer that question and to find your answers. And some people do. Some people discover who they are, they discover their own hobbies, they find themselves again. Some people, get stronger with their spouses, because oftentimes if people are so focused on the kids, they forget about the spouse in that way sometimes. So when the kids leave, all of a sudden you get to sometimes strengthen that relationship, and that's the hope, of course, that you haven't spent too much time apart, that there's nothing left. You want to make sure, of course, there is something left. So you owe it to yourself to go and look into that. So that's really, really important. Loss of identity because of a spouse. Does your question allude to still a living person or not?
I'm not sure it matters at this point.
Okay.
I'm wondering about the benefit, as I was listening to, of I think we all have multiple identities within us.
Yes.
That if we lose one, the choice we have is to focus exclusively on what we've lost, or lean into the other ones, and then process the one that we don't have access to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what I was alluding to earlier, right? What is your social identity? How can you see yourself beyond your physicality in that way? So that's really, really important, that you can rely on your identity and different identities. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You want to get the sense that you are vast, you've got different identities that you can feed off of in some ways. And this is interesting because I noticed that there's a lot of women here, especially too, some men, thankfully, that's good, of course. It's always good that there's men here, of course, too. But women are especially interested in questions like this, because I find that your question when it comes to loss of a spouse, I find that women in general tend to invest themselves heavily in their relationships with their spouse. And what happens oftentimes with women is that women like to learn more about the man, and they like to learn more about what their interests are and such, you know, and to really connect with them on those levels. For men, it's different. We don't do it quite that same way as women do. But women do that. They really like to get to know the man. What's he interested in? I'll be interested in that so I can feel closer to him, you know? And that's why you often hear women saying, you know, I gave all of myself, you know, if the relationship ends, I lost myself completely, you know? Even if the relationship still continues, some of these questions pop up even if the relationship is going still. And oftentimes, you know, this is something that we sometimes have to look at is how can you reclaim yourself, you know? How can you find yourself amidst the relationship where you don't lose yourself entirely, where you can still be yourself? And this is where having more of these differing identities, you know, are you exercising your creativity? Are you meeting with your friends? Are you allowing yourself to be authentic with yourself? That's a really, really important question, I find, you know, and women tend to ask these questions more than men in general, but men do have times where they get to do that, and I'm glad that we are asking those questions too, because we need that. We need to be real with ourselves especially, you know.
I think it can be helpful if we reframe, talking about loss of identity, I'm thinking about people who retire.
Yeah.
You know, so what do you do? And the answer is, I am. Well, that's not quite right. I work as.
Yes.
I think would be a healthier question
Yes.
or healthier response, because I'm a teacher.
Yep.
Teachers are lifelong, I know that. So how do you deal with the fact that, well, I'm no longer teaching, right? So,
Yeah. You know, a lot of us do vocational work where we're feeling something is like really, really heartfelt, you know? And like you said, teachers do that, you know, military folks as well too. They go into it because they believe in it. They want to make a difference in the world, you know? Stuff has happened in the world, they want to be part of it, that they're okay to enable change. That's what they want to do, you know? So that's a hard question for a lot of people when people lose capacity, but also like who are they when they have medical releases in some ways, or in the military, or just retiring, like you said, of course, you know? If the retirement is involuntary, it's more difficult in the sense that you didn't choose it. It's been chosen for you. So you get the sense that your career's been cut short, you know, whether you agree with it or not. Usually if it's involuntary, you're not agreeing with it, right? So that's the thing. So I find that often it's difficult because we do have to work on finding out who we are, right? And it's just, and you're right in that the sense that it's a job. In the end, what was the reason why? And it was because it gave you some funds to live the life that you wanted to outside of work, right? That's how work should be. If you're not a workaholic, of course, you know, which is it's a whole other issue, of course. But yeah, it's true though that when you retire, you're having to reinvent yourself. And I like that term in terms of reinventing, because it means that now you get to define what you've acquired over the span of your work in terms of doing a bit of a check-in with yourself. I was talking earlier about doing the inventory of what you have with someone else, but you can do this inventory with yourself as well, where you look at yourself. In French, there's an expression that says bilan de vie, you know, where you kind of do a bit of a life analysis and to see in some ways, like, what is it that you've acquired? What is it you've learned in some ways, you know, that you can sometimes ask yourself now, and what does it mean? What's left that's unexplored that perhaps you had to put aside because you were working? You know, that's the thing that happens. You know, it can be scary in some ways to have all this time all of a sudden, but it can also be seen as an opportunity. That now you've got the time to maybe explore some things that you never had a chance to explore before, because you're too busy working. You know, what is it you've left aside? And sometimes what I like to do with that is I like to ask people, you know, when I ask them who they are and they say, I don't know, I ask them, like, what is it that you set aside when you were a teenager, just before you grew up to become an adult? And that's a really good question, you know? And some people tell me, oh, well, I used to enjoy dancing. Okay. Is that something you'd still like to pick up in some ways? Oh, I used to write, or I used to draw. I used to enjoy doing that a lot, you know, okay. So you got a bit of a creative streak. You think now's the time maybe to explore that? You think now maybe joining an art association might do that for you? You know, so it's always good to ask that question. It's always good to ask, like, what is it that I left aside at a given time in my life? You know, because we're all forced to make decisions